Hey folks, just wanted to take a quick break here to talk about a video that I came across from Alex O'Connor. It's a short clip, 60 seconds or so, discussing the issue of free will and sort of Alex's position, which is not unique to him, that the possibility of free will is entirely logically excluded. And I'm going to get into why that's inaccurate, and some general problems that I have even with the framing. This comes up a lot, and it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and so have some opinions on. And feel like it's worth taking some time to share it with you guys. So so let's just jump in. I'm gonna let the whole clip play, and then I'll come back and share some thoughts, and then we'll go and dissect some portions of that clip, and maybe even sprinkle in some other clips as well.
The argument against free will, in my view, we can build an argument, I think, from a law of logic. The proposition that P must either be true or false, and it can't be both, it can't be neither. We can simply ask a question of any kind of mental activity. Is it determined or is it not? That is it determined by anything else, or is it completely undetermined by anything? If it's undetermined by anything, then it's random, and you're by definition not in control of that which is random. If it's determined by something, then it's either determined by something further inside your mind, or it's determined by something external to your brain. If it's determined by something external to yourself, if that's what's determining the action, then clearly you're not in ultimate control of that action. If it's something inside of yourself somewhere, then all you do is push the problem back, and you ask the question again, is that thing determined or is it indeterminate? Either of which you are completely out of control in. If you say that it terminates in something like a soul, people like to do this. They say, well, look, with the religious philosophy, we have the benefit of introducing a soul. That doesn't solve anything. It's not a matter of having to explain the mechanism by which the soul brings about actions. That may well be a mystery. But if it is the case that whatever it is that's doing that is either determined or it's not, and that if it's not, it's random and therefore out of your control, and that if it is, it ultimately terminates in something outside of yourself or something random, and both of which are out of your control, free will cannot exist.
So here, Alex frames the proposition here as this: either something is determined or it's not. And he poses the law of excluded middle as the backdrop. And so for now, there's nothing particularly wrong with this, nor especially insightful. This is more or less basic. And that's especially true, where, at least not where the law of excluded middle is merely just stating that a proposition is either true or not true, i.e. there's no middle ground. So no problem with that as it's stated so far. The problem is that Alex misframes the set as one that necessarily excludes free will. And so we're going to get into why that is, a bit later. But this does bring us to the related mathematical concept of set theory. But again, we don't need to be particularly technical here. This particular argument as framed does not require that. However, for the law of excluded middle to apply here, we do need to clearly define a set. So some examples for a valid set would be that your actions are either random or they're not. That's a set. And only one of these or the other is true necessarily. It could also be that your actions are either determined or they're not. Again, that's a different set. And for now, we don't even need to define the words random or determined. I mean, we will do that here shortly. In a slightly different context, but the point is we could say this for anything. So even without knowing the definition, for example, your organs are either giblets or they're not. Your organs are either vibranium or they're not. Again, we don't even need to define giblets or vibranium at the outset in order to frame the logical proposition of excluded middle. Okay, so what's the problem here? And this is something that frustrates me as a tiny, insignificant YouTuber, because I see huge names and very smart people totally whiffing on and even permitting arguments that wouldn't make it past the average dinner table of sort of much quote unquote lesser folks. The problem here is that Alex improperly compares two different sets together. The determined, not determined set as one, and the random, not random set as the other. And again, even without defining what these words mean just yet, we invalidate the law of excluded middle without more when we do something like your organs are either vibranium or they're giblets. It should be said that the proposition could be valid and it could be a law of excluded middle situation too. But without more, we cannot say that. We need to define what we mean by giblets and vibranium if we're to compare them at all. And here Alex fatally, and I must say surprisingly, kind of botches the framing. Before we go on, I'm not trying to. This is not an attack on Alex. I mean, the guy's brilliant. You guys, hopefully, if you watch the channel, I'm a big fan. I love the way he thinks. I'm not attacking him here, and I'll even go further to say that in a 60-second video, as I've always said, context is lost, nuance is lost, etc. So this is more of an issue of how critical it is to properly define your sets when you're making arguments that lean in any way on set theory. So anyway, let's start with the quote-unquote easier set, random versus not random. So we can do a deep dive down many rabbit holes here, including some who will argue that nothing can ever be truly random, etc. But for now, let's just appeal to a simple definition, one that's fairly intuitive, and the one that's kind of obviously meant by Alex when he says random is something that is undetermined by anything. So many of you probably already see the problem here because it's not clear what determined means just yet. But let's not quibble just yet. We'll appeal to this intuitive randomness here as something uncaused or uncontrolled by any external or conscious being, i.e. what occurs by naturally letting purely natural actions play out without any unnatural influence. Okay, so this will raise its own problems, but we'll get to that shortly. So at this point, the set is determined or undetermined by anything, which Alex describes as random. Again, we'll come back to the problem with that in a bit. So we think we know what random is, i.e. undetermined by anything as defined by Alex. And so logically, if we're talking about the law of excluded middle, then determined must mean non-random. The opposite of undetermined by anything, i.e. determined by something. In other words, whatever is not random is by definition here determined. So I hope you're with me so far. But Alex says that something determined is determined by something further inside your mind or by something external to yourself. Now, this is frustrating because a scientist, specifically a scientist who is a pure naturalist, will say that something quote unquote inside your mind and even the quote unquote something external to yourself is also by definition uncaused, i.e. uninfluenced by anything external to the system, any conscious being, etc. And there are equations that can predict what will take place next, and there is no quote-unquote libertarian means by which a being like us can alter those equations. So the scientist says that we're all comprised of atoms and that science can tell us how any atom in a certain situation will behave, and thus if I can understand all of the atoms, some 10 to the 30th of them, and the external factors surrounding them, pressure, temperature, etc., then I can predict what each atom will do, and then ultimately what the totality of atoms acting together will do. So let's kick it for now to the awesome Dr. Sabine Hassenfelder to explain this in a bit more detail.
And we begin, of course, with physics. Everything in the universe is made of 25 particles that, for all we currently know, are not themselves made of any smaller constituents. We collect them in what's called the standard model of particle physics. That's everything in the universe except possibly dark matter, but that's a different story. Most of those particles are unstable and decay very quickly. How can it be that a particle which isn't made of anything can decay? That's a question I get so frequently, I made a video about that specifically. For now, let's stick with the particles that are stable. Those are the ones that we are made of. Electrons, up and down quarks, and photons and gluons to hold them together. And good thing they're stable, because otherwise you'd be more radiant than a nuclear fuel rod. You'd also be dead very quickly. Okay, so humans are one big collection of particles. What the particles do is described by the mathematics of the Standard Model. It's a lot of maths, and you need that maths if you want to answer difficult questions like what's going on in LHC collisions. For simple questions like whether free will exists, we don't need to know much about the maths. Relevant is just that ultimately what you and I do is also described by the Standard Model. And yes, that means that we know the equations for human behavior. We can write them down. In practice, that's a completely useless statement because we can't solve the equations for all these 10 to the 30 or so particles that humans are made of. Not even the biggest supercomputer in the world could do that. But we don't need to solve the equations to draw conclusions from their properties. For the purposes of this video, the most relevant property of these equations is that they are deterministic, which means that if you know the properties and motions of the particles at one time, you can calculate what happens at any later time. Okay, it isn't quite as simple, because this is quantum physics. So on top of this deterministic behavior, there's an occasional quantum jump, which happens randomly whenever you make a measurement. You all know that I don't believe this stuff with the quantum jumps, but today I'll stick with the most generally accepted theory. So we have particles that behave deterministically, plus random jumps. In quantum mechanics, we use wave functions to describe the particles, and this implies that there are some quantities, like position and momentum, whose values you can't know precisely at the same time. But the wave function still changes deterministically. If you want, you can include gravity, but that's just a deterministic theory, a non-quantum theory or a classical theory, as physicists say. So gravity just adds some more determinism on top. And that's how the universe works, for all we currently know. It's one big wave function that contains all those particles. Its change in time is deterministic with the occasional random jump. The deterministic part is fixed by the past. The random jumps cannot be influenced by anything because that's what it means for them to be random. And that's it. Please don't blame me for this. I swear it wasn't my idea.
So obviously this is untestable because the variables are just far too many to ever control for in any testable environment. But the conclusion drawn from this, if the math is correct, is that your actions are purely determined. And you can't, by some law of nature independent of natural laws, alter that. So I argue, and I've argued elsewhere, that at least at a macro level, that too is random, in that for everything we think we see at a macro level, again, if we're just talking scientifically here, if it really is correct that it all comes down to predictable atomic actions, and we're dealing with so many atoms that it's really impossible to calculate all of the potential variables, then we're dealing with macro randomness in that it's almost incalculable, near infinite, if not actually infinite, the set of possible actions that can take place in any macro environment next. So again, we'll kick it back to Dr. Sabine, and she will discuss both the really important concept of emergence, which I've started to touch upon here, and also the slightly more nuanced concept of determinism versus so pure determinism versus determinism plus some level of indeterminism as brought in by quantum mechanics.
Physics is great, but it doesn't tell you much about human anatomy, other than possibly that flapping your arms won't make you fly. That's because if you combine many particles, then things get very complicated very quickly. You get new emergent behavior, as it's often called. You don't even need to look at difficult things like human beings to see that. If you do as much as combine atoms to big chunks called metals, you get new behavior, like the ability to conduct electricity, or being very shiny, or being very painful if they fall on your foot. Emergent properties don't exist on the level of constituents. They arise from the properties and interactions of the constituents. A single electron doesn't have a conductivity. That just doesn't make sense. Conductivity is a property that only makes sense for large collections of electrons. It doesn't make sense to talk about the conductivity of an electron for the same reason it doesn't make sense to ask whether a single oxygen atom is a gas, or what's the marital status of your small intestine. It's what philosophers call a category error. It'd be trying to assign a property to a class to which it doesn't belong. Emergent properties don't make sense on the underlying levels, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. Chairs exist, all right, but they exist on the macroscopic level and not on the level of elementary particles. Curiously enough, our universe is organized so that the details of what happens at short distances become less important at large distances. This is why, if you want to understand planetary motion, you don't need to know the population of New York City. This is why, if you want to understand chemical reactions, you don't need to know the standard model of particle physics. And this is why, if you want to become a YouTuber, you don't need to know anything. Physicists call it the decoupling of scales, the mysterious but empirically well-confirmed fact that the details of what goes on at small scales can be disregarded if you're only interested in what happens on large scales. And this is why we have so many disciplines of science, because each discipline of science has its own language about emergent properties that are adequate to its subject. But that we get new emergent properties from the interactions of the constituents doesn't mean the equations that determine the behavior of the constituents do no longer apply. Emergent behavior is a consequence of combining large numbers of particles with complicated interactions. It follows from the underlying laws. It doesn't make them go away. Some philosophers have speculated that large systems could have emergent behaviors which don't follow from the laws of the constituents. This is sometimes called strong emergence, but there's no evidence this happens in the real world. Though there are some mathematical examples. If you have an infinite number of constituents or an infinite number of properties of the constituents or anything else being actually infinite, there are cases where it becomes impossible to calculate one or the other quantity of the entire system. A few examples for this have been constructed in the literature. Usually the proof works by a map to the halting problem or similar examples of computational complexity. However, those are mathematical constructions that have no real-world counterpart, because in the real world, nothing is ever truly infinite.
So I hope that makes sense, right? Again, for a specific atom, or even a specific, small subset of atoms, it's fairly easy to predict what will happen next in a controlled environment. But as we get to the magnitude we're talking about here, again, 10 to the 30, 10 to the 80, etc. When we get to numbers at that level, and what we're talking for each atom, we're talking about also additional variables, again, such as temperature and pressure and humidity and a bunch of other things. It becomes impossible to, at a macro level, predict when the leaf is going to fall from the tree, or when the butterfly is going to flap its wings, or when some cat's going to meow, or when a human is going to press the button to activate the crosswalk, etc. And so at a macro level, these emergent properties make predicting what will happen next essentially random, given the almost infinite number of permutations. So while my argument for macro randomness doesn't per se invalidate Alex's set just yet, it does make it really important then to go back to what we mean by random. Because if determined means what I've just described scientifically, then non-determined cannot simply mean what Alex is calling random, i.e. something undetermined by anything. No, in this case, if something is not determined, then it's something that is not abiding by the law of physics or science. It could be something aphysical. It could be some aphysical notion of pure randomness, I suppose, right? Just pure chaos, pure randomness. It's aphysical, it's outside the laws of physics, etc. Sure. But that's not the entirety of the remainder of the set. Because it could also, in fact, be something potentially caused or supernaturally permitted. So it need not be, in other words, simply random in that it's entirely uncaused. Again, here, random has no real meaning as previously defined, because random now means that it's not determined and thus not abiding by the natural laws of physics, for example. So even if random means random in some quantum physical sense, then arguably that's still determined in that even though we can't predict with certainty, what a particular quantum particle might do next, making that action random in a sense, it's still not deviating from natural laws of physics, and we can calculate the probabilities for those particles and actions and whatnot. And so, I don't want to, go down that rabbit hole yet, just to say that the macro actor, us, has no more ability to affect those quantum random particles any more than the ability to affect traditional particles. And so, again, it's if we're talking about something being determined, then what we're saying here is that it's something that is abiding by the natural laws of physics, which include, quantum physics. Now, if Alex is indeed contrasting traditional Newtonian physics with quantum physics here and using determinism to apply more in the traditional sense and randomness to apply to this other subset that could be classified as falling under quantum mechanics, then that's fine. And then that represents a misunderstanding on my end of what it is he's trying to say. There are additional ramifications that come from that still get us to the same conclusion. But at least as far as the framing, I think the way I've characterized it would be somewhat inaccurate. I don't think that's what he's saying, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing that. If that is, or if someone knows better, just drop it in the comments, and I'll come back and amend it or do something else here. For our purposes here, going forward, taking what Alex is describing as determined, we are going to couple, strong Newtonian determinism with the scientific indeterminism that comes from quantum mechanics, and put those together and lump that entirely in the group of determinism for the purposes of this discussion philosophically. I think that's the right way to do this. Again, if I'm wrong on that, someone can correct me and drop it in the comments. So I get the sense that Alex anticipates this when he talks about souls, etc. But remember, the theist who is arguing for free will is essentially arguing, whether knowingly or not, that human beings are able to make decisions that alter what the laws of physics would naturally predict. For example, a theist could say that there's some, supernatural or God-given force that we can tap into that allows us to influence the action of any quantum particle or even the assembly of particles in such a way that allows us to force those particles to, make us choose to eat the ice cream or allow us to have the willpower to skip it. And if we wanted to stick to a more sort of classical scientific approach here, the theist could still argue that the concept of free will is an emergent property where we can't really understand it by just looking at the smaller constituent parts. It only takes on meaning when the aggregate of all of the contributors to that come into play, as any other emergent property. And I think that is also a valid way that is not excluded by the set that Alex lays out here. And just again here, even though this particular video is not focusing on necessarily the proofs for free will, what we're looking at here is just this logical framework as laid out by Alex. So this is just a logic exercise. We're not actually undergoing the work, to the detailed work that it would take to prove out the neuroscience, etc. It should be noted that merely saying that, well, you don't have free will because, for example, Phineas Gage, when he had these sort of iron pipe shafted through his brain, began to act in an entirely different way. And so that tells us that there's portions of the brain that determine how humans behave, or when we see things that say, hey, when I put you under anesthesia, there's certain things you can't do, or that shows that you don't have free will in that sense, or when we say things like there are aspects of decisions that are made when you're hungry that you would potentially make different decisions if you weren't hungry, etc. Or even the notion that we didn't get to choose our bodies or our soul or our family, and so therefore we can't have free will. All of these concepts don't get to the fundamental question that the theist is raising with respect to free will. The fact that Phineas Gage's personality changed entirely after his accident doesn't negate the potential possibility that there could be, for example, a free will center in the frontal cortex. It's just but one example, that when that's obstructed, then one's ability to take clear control over their actions is also somehow disrupted. And the fact that the soul that you were given was not something that you chose doesn't mean that, say, if a creator imbued you with that soul that you had no choice in getting, that you couldn't then from that point forward still choose whether or not you wanted to believe in God or not, or eat ice cream or not, or again any sort of argument based on neuroscience or neurochemistry that shows, hey, we understand patterns of behavior and we understand how neurochemical processes influence behavior. For example, how those who are in a state of hunger may, I think I've seen Professor Sapolsky, give the example of how judges who were hungry at the time they heard cases were some significant level more likely to give convictions or longer sentences than judges who were well fed. Because we know that does not also mean that there's no ability for the human, through some metaphysical or supernatural process, undefined. Again, that's the question. That's the question that's being begged here, to override that and say, I'm not going to succumb to that. For the judge who's starving to say, you know what, I recognize that I'm starving. I'm recognizing that I'm, potentially going to make some bad decisions. I'm going to override that, and I'm going to do what I think is right. The argument that the theist is making is that that is possible. And as discussed, it is worth noting that even within the framework of determinism, free will can still be argued to be a scientifically purely natural process, an emergent process that occurs at a very late stage that can't be simply understood by looking at purely the constituents, that free will only takes form as being anything viable or meaningful when it reaches the state of emergence, when all factors come together and perhaps give us this natural deterministic ability to act on the underlying constituents to truly make the next actions that we take actions that we have control over. We just don't understand this enough, and we probably never will understand this enough to eliminate even that possibility from the purely scientific realm, let alone the theistic one. And so, with respect to this concept of a natural aspect of free will, again, when I'm describing determinism here, what I'm saying is this particular framing of free will would be one that would not require an external actor, a creator, etc., or any kind of magical life force or supernatural life force or anything like that. It would be purely governed by entirely natural processes. And so that's also still included within the set of possibilities here with respect to free will. And so both under natural and supernatural framings, there is within the set as described by Alex, again, somewhat, incompletely, as I've said, is the possibility of this natural concept of free will in addition to the theistic one. All right, so let's just move on here. So whether it's this or any other framework that simply just declares that free will is impossible as just a statement in and of itself, does not help advance in any way the argument here or the analysis. It doesn't help lead to any additional understanding. It reflects a bias that one's entitled to have, but it certainly doesn't obligate the opponent to accept. So back to the situation where the theist is arguing that there's some supernatural means by which the theist can make the choice of whether or not to eat ice cream. Here, in this sense, actions are also random in that, in the scientific sense, there's no equation that could have predicted the outcome of whether I would have eaten the ice cream or not, because the human actor is drawing on some quote-unquote force, as it were, to influence its specific collection of subatomic particles in order to take any specific action or not. And because the human actor has totally idiosyncratic control over that decision, it's essentially scientifically random in that there's no way for any set of tests to predict what that human actor would do next. But more importantly, it falls within the realm of something being not determined. So now the scientist says that's all nonsense, and that's fine. Again, there's no problem with that. I don't have a problem with that per se here. That's not the point of this analysis. They'll say, hey, this whole idea of some kind of supernatural force or whatever, pure nonsense, pure theological gobbledygook, untestable, unfalsifiable. We don't need to deal with it. Sure, that's fine. That doesn't invalidate the argument here, because the point here is that the set is something that is determined, as we're talking about abiding by the laws of natural physical laws and whatnot, versus something that is not determined. And not determined necessarily can include entire randomness, again, whatever that may be, or caused actions by a conscious being, us, or supernatural, or both. I want to be clear. It's not enough to just come and say, hey, no, we're only applying natural law to the set. That arbitrary restriction is fine if we're just talking purely about natural law, but we shouldn't be restricted to that when we're talking about something like free will, because again, the theist is going to say the set that the theist is dealing with includes the potential for there to be supernatural law. That is the question. In fact, it's the framing the set otherwise just begs the question of whether there is something potentially supernatural or not. And you can't create the set by saying, nope, there is nothing supernatural, because you're just begging the question. And once again, even if you did it this way, it could still be argued that the free will concept can fall under the purely natural concepts as we discussed with respect to emergence. And so free will could be an emergent property that could very well exist naturally and not be understood merely by looking at the underlying constituents. And so what does this mean for us with respect to the concept of free will? So for the scientist, again, for the pure naturalist, the argument will be that free will is either an illusion or is impossible in that the actions that all of the particles take that comprise the individual are all predictable, set, and predetermined already in terms of what they're going to do. And so any further action, including me making this video, has been already scientifically predetermined, and that there's no need for and no room to postulate any sort of additional, causal actor there. That's fine. There's no problem with that. The scientist and naturalist there is presupposing the exclusion of the possibility of a supernatural actor or anything supernatural or anything externally caused. That's presupposed in their conclusion there. And so as long as their framework excludes that possibility from the outset, then the rest of the framing can make sense. So if we're talking purely scientifically and you want us to start with the presupposition that there is no external creator, there is no external causal agent, okay, then sure, yeah, well, that's fine. That's not really what the question though is, amongst, at least as between the theist and non-theist, or the theist and the scientist, etc., with respect to this question. So with respect to the question, at least philosophically, of whether there's free will or not, I think where this leaves us is, at least as framed here by Alex, and again, many others, it leaves us absolutely with a set of options that don't per se exclude a causal agent or the ability for a macro actor, a human being in this case, to act in a way that could allow that person to have acted differently. That's not excluded by the philosophical framing as laid out here by Alex, and is not excluded by any potential philosophical framing that can be laid out. The only way that can be excluded necessarily, the only way it can be rendered necessarily false, is to assume that at the outset, as the scientist does, which is to assume at the outset that nope, there is no God. We reject it outright, and then draw conclusions based on that. If you're not doing that, and again, we can't do that because that's the question that we're asking here, is it possible for there to be such a thing as free will, which includes the possibility of there being a supernatural force behind that, then we have not been given any set, and we can't be given any set that necessarily makes the possibility of human free will, the potential to have acted differently, as a simple definition. Again, there are many definitions. There's nothing we've been given that makes that necessarily false. And so as long as it's not necessarily false, we must continue to include it in the possibility of potential explanations for the actions that humans take. And so now, remember, just for completion's sake, again, because here we're not laying out the full scientific proofs, we do also have to account for the possibility that there could be a purely natural explanation for free will as an emergent property that can emerge in a scientifically deterministic way, i.e. in a way that is uncaused, that is not brought about by any external factor or external actor or life force or supernatural force or anything like that. We do have to also account for that possibility as well, and recognize that simply because we don't have a sort of clear indication that property can be in existence from looking at the underlying constituents, As we know, for example, with electrons and conduction, as discussed earlier, it doesn't mean that, given our primitive understanding of this concept, in totality, that can't be an emergent property that we just don't yet understand. So for completion, we have to also include that even within the natural framework. All right. So that's basically the conclusion here for this particular video. Now, I do want to just take a moment to talk about why I think this is an important topic broadly. One aspect here is, as I've discussed elsewhere, that the concept of free will is really an essential concept to at least the notion of Christianity. At least most forms of Christianity assume that God, as one of God's sort of benevolent gifts, imbued humans with the ability to make free choices. So that's one issue, but that's not even really the most important issue, at least for the purposes of this video, because the other side of it is, what does it mean if we truly get to the point where we feel compelled to argue that humans do not have free will, that we don't have the ability to affect the choices that we make? There are real sociological impacts of reaching that conclusion. And in fact, there's no way around the deleterious and harmful ramifications of that. There's no way around it. I hear philosophers trying to dance around this issue all the time. It doesn't work. If the conclusion that one reaches is that humans have absolutely no control whatsoever over the actions that we take, then it is by definition, and it cannot be argued otherwise, complete absolution of humans for any responsibility for any actions that are taken. It has to be that way. The entire concept of determining whether someone is at fault or not is completely disappears. And then there are even further questions, like what does it mean in terms of what to do next? Because if the argument is, well, we have no choice, then arguably we are just literally robots, pre-programmed robots, heading down a pre-programmed course. Again, this is the argument, even in the Christian context, for predeterminism. When theists, and Christians are arguing that there's no concept of free will, this is the same issue, right? If we don't have the ability to make any choices, then what does that mean for how we conduct our daily lives? And you'll see there's no conclusion that is satisfactory. Take a look at this maddeningly and frustratingly inconsistent clip from Sam Harris.
The sense of self and free will are closely related. I often describe them as two sides of the same coin, but they're not quite the same in their spuriousness. So the sense of self is something that people, I think, do experience, right? It's not a very clear experience, but it's not, I wouldn't call the illusion of self an illusion. But the illusion of free will is an illusion in that as you pay more attention to your experience, you begin to see that it's totally compatible with an absence of free will. You don't, coming back to the place we started, you don't know what you're going to think next. You don't know what you're going to intend next. You don't know what's going to just occur to you that you must do next. You don't know how much you're going to feel the behavioral imperative to act on that thought. If you suddenly feel, oh, I don't need to do that, I can do that tomorrow, you don't know where that comes from. You didn't know that was going to arise. You didn't know that was going to be compelling. All of this is compatible with some evil genius in the next room just typing in code into your experience. It's like this, okay, let's give him the, oh my God, I just forgot it was going to be our anniversary in 1 week thought, right? Give him the cascade of fear. Give him this brilliant idea for the thing he can buy that's going to take him no time at all, and this overpowering sense of relief. All of our experience is compatible with the script already being written, right? And I'm not saying the script is written. I'm not saying that fatalism is is the right way to look at this. But we just don't have even our most deliberate voluntary action where we go back and forth between two options, thinking about the reason for A and then reconsidering and going to thinking harder about B and just going eeny, meeny, miny, mo until the end of the hour. However laborious you can make it, there is a utter mystery at your back finally promoting the thought or intention or rationale that is most compelling and therefore deliberate, behaviorally effective, and just. I mean, this can drive some people a little crazy. So I usually preface what I say about free will with the caveat that if thinking about your mind this way makes you feel terrible, well then stop. You get off the ride. Switch the channel. You don't have to go down this path. But for me and for many other people, it's incredibly freeing to recognize this about the mind, because one, you realize that so cutting through the illusion of the self is immensely freeing for a lot of reasons that we can talk about separately. But losing the sense of free will does two things very vividly for me. One is it totally undercuts the psychological basis for hatred, right? Because when you think about the experience of hating other people, what that is anchored to is a feeling that they really are the true authors of their actions. I mean, someone is doing something that you find so despicable, right? Let's say they're targeting you unfairly, right? They're maligning you on Twitter, or they're suing you, or they're doing something. They broke your car window. They did something awful, and now you have a grievance against them, and you're relating to them very differently emotionally in your own mind than you would if a force of nature had done this, right? Or if it had just been, a virus, or if it had been a wild animal, or a malfunctioning machine, right? Like, to those things, you don't attribute any kind of freedom of will. And while you may suffer the consequences of catching a virus or being attacked by a wild animal or having your car break down or whatever, it may frustrate you. You don't slip into this mode of hating the agent in a way that completely commandeers your mind and deranges your life. I mean, you just don't. I mean, there are people who spend decades hating other people for what they did, and it's just pure poison. Right?
So it's a useful shortcut to compassion and empathy.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, this is pure nonsense. This is, again, this is not personal to Sam Harris, but this is pure and unadulterated nonsense for a number of reasons, and I feel like I need to spend a little bit of time on this. So the first aspect here is one of false dichotomies. This is logically fallacious reasoning that's being used here. So what does it mean to say that because I had let's just accept that I may not have known whether I was going to feel hungry in the next moment, or what thought was going to jump into my head at the next moment. Let's even say that that's true. Why does that exclude the possibility that where I do have enough information, for example, I have a cup of ice cream sitting in front of me, why does that previous bit of information that I didn't know that I was going to have a hunger pang mean that when the bowl of ice cream is sitting in front of me, I can't then choose to either take a bite or not? It's a false dichotomy to say that because some things come into our conscious or into our awareness, etc., through no action of our own, through no ability of ourselves to control, that means we have no ability to control any action. Okay, hopefully it's obvious that is a true false dichotomy. It is a logical fallacy. All right, next, let's just turn. I mean, there's several things, but just to keep this somewhat brief. Let's turn on this issue of how if you don't like where this leads, just get off the train. Stop. We can't get off the train. You told us we can't. What the idea here is that even that notion of not liking it and hating this and feeling uncomfortable with this is determined according to the arguments you're presenting to us. We don't have a choice to get off the train. The arrogance of making a statement like this and then just saying, hey, well, if you don't like it, just get off. It's mind-boggling to me. And it's intellectually dishonest. We don't have a choice to get off the train if what we're being told here with respect to free will is true. And we don't have the ability to say we are going to hate or not hate someone, or forgive or not forgive someone, or relieve ourselves of all the burdens that come from assigning guilt and blame if we don't have the ability to make those choices in the first place. And if we do have the ability to make those choices and we can direct ourselves to say, hey, you know what? I'm no longer going to hate Jimmy for punching me in the face when I was in 4th grade. If we do have the ability to make that choice independently, that is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about free will. If I can choose to say I'm going to hate Jimmy or not, if I can make that choice, if that's the argument, that is what we're saying when we say human beings have free will. I can make the choice to forgive Jimmy and relieve myself from that burden of hating him or not. It's just bafflingly intellectually dishonest. And again, it's not a Sam Harris thing. This is across the board with those who argue against the concept of free will, to then turn around and tell us to act as if we do have free will, because it is inherently inconsistent. We cannot act that way if what you're saying is true. Now, what I propose, and what many in the theistic camp, and even those who aren't in the theistic camp propose, is that we do have the ability to make these decisions. And so where the position that I'm advocating is not excluded, it's the better position to take given the implications for society. All of the conclusions that flow from the assessment that there is no such thing as free will are absurd and nonsensical, and there's no reason for us to force ourselves into taking nonsensical and absurd positions unless we're absolutely compelled to. In other words, unless we have necessarily excluded the other possibilities, such as the possibility of there being actual free will. Without excluding that possibility, it is entirely absurd, nonsensical, and even idiotic to pretend that we are able to conduct our lives as if this concept of free will doesn't exist. It is complete nonsense. So to wrap up, Alex O'Connor and those who make the same argument that Alex makes here has done nothing to eliminate the potential of free will logically or philosophically from being within the set of options. Nothing has been done, absolutely nothing. It is completely as viable as it has always been, at least under this logical framework. Same to be said for the neuroscience and scientific theories that we didn't really cover here. Again, they don't exclude the potential for there to be something supernatural. And by the way, it's not just simply because anything can be supernatural. It's because we have a very limited understanding and probably never will truly understand exactly what goes into consciousness, decision making, etc. We're in primitive stages, and for those who understand the science, we may never get to the point of fully understanding what is consciousness, what is being, what is self, what are all these other things, at least from a scientific standpoint. So there's that. And then finally, the important point of this, the crux of this, is its impact on our daily lives, and simply telling us that, hey, we have no free will, but go on and live your life as if we do, is ridiculous. It's preposterous. You can't have us take two positions that can't be reconciled. If we don't have free will, then we don't have any choice in that matter, and what will happen is what happens. And if we do have free will, then we carry on as we always have, which is under the assumption that we can choose actions that we take, we can hold people accountable for actions that they take, etc. I personally think it's a much happier way to live. I think that's the stronger of the positions. I'm not going to argue that in any detail here, but just feel like that's a good point to kind of wrap up this video. So as always, please like and subscribe and all that good stuff, and we'll talk soon.